Hello everyone, Professor Krislick here. So in our last video, we briefly introduced the European coal and steel community as an example of liberal internationalism in practice, kind of a case study for when countries come together to try to eliminate and work around the anarchic international system. So we know, and from that video we talked about that after World War II, France and West Germany helped build a new European order by placing coal and steel production under shared institutional control. The idea was the industries that were most closely connected to war could be transformed into the basis for cooperation. And again, we have to think about the era that this emerged in, coming out of the First World War, coming out of the Second World War, trying to find a way to make sure a third major European World War didn't occur. So over time, that project helped support Franco-German reconciliation and in fact laid the groundwork for future European integration. And it comes across as a success story of liberal internationalism, a success story of how to build institutions so you can have cooperation on the global stage. But this does raise a pretty important question. If economic interdependence helps stabilize relations among Western European states, could the same logic work for potential adversaries? And could it work for Russia? So for much of the post-Cold War period, so we can think of this collapse of the Soviet Union in 91, the dissipating of the Cold War. Many European leaders hoped the answer would be yes. This is a way to bring Russia in from the cold. They believed, these European leaders believed, that trade, investment, and importantly, energy cooperation and diplomatic engagement could gradually pull Russia closer to Europe. The logic was not exactly the same as the European coal and steel community, but it came from a similar liberal intuition that more states cooperate economically, the less incentive they should have or they would have to fight with one another. This was especially important for Russia and Germany. German policy towards Russia was shaped by a long tradition of engagement, often with the purpose of reducing conflict through dialogue, through contact, through practical cooperation. So in this post-Cold War period, this became closely connected to the ideas of change through trade. The assumption was that if Russia became more closely tied to Germany, more closely tied to Europe, more closely tied to Europe economically, Moscow would have less reasons to disrupt the relationship through aggression or confrontation. Chatham House, the think tank, describes this logic as the belief that deeper German and European economic ties would make Russia less likely to threaten the status quo, because doing so would endanger profitable economic relationships. At first glance, this seems quite plausible and in line with liberal internationalism, liberal institutionalism, this idea that we can have more cooperative economies. But remember, this video is about when maybe that didn't hold true and didn't work out as expected. We know, because it's in the news all the time, that Russia has and had enormous energy resources. And Europe, Germany, across Europe, they needed energy. Germany, in particular, needed reliable natural gas for its industrial growth, for eventually its movement away from nuclear power, its eventual movement away from nuclear energy. So, from a liberal perspective, this looked like a pretty mutually beneficial agreement and pretty mutually beneficial relationship. Russia would sell gas, Germany and Europe would buy it. Their economies would become closely intertwined. Both sides would thus profit from this. And because both sides benefited, both sides would have incentives to maintain stable relationships and not go to war with each other. The problem is that independence does not always, and it has proven that it does not always produce peace. Sometimes it produces leverage. And this has been something that we've heard a lot about since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by the Russians. So if the central lesson of the European and Russia energy relationship is that this idea of liberal institutionalism sometimes doesn't play out as it is originally designed. Over time, Russia and other European states did become deeply connected to Russian energy supplies. Pipelines physically tied Russian gas fields to European consumers. German companies invested in long-term energy relationships. The Nord Stream pipeline, maybe a pipeline you've heard of, or Nord Stream 2, was in the news a lot in 2022. The Nord Stream pipeline symbolized this connection by linking Russia directly to Germany through the Baltic Sea. Nord Stream 2, in particular, became one of the most controversial infrastructure projects in all of Europe. Again, you've probably heard of it maybe in 2022, 2023, after the full-scale invasion, because of this reliance on Russia. And would Europe want to continue to buy and purchase energy resources from Russia to fund their war machine? So Nord Stream 2 was completed in 2021, but it was never brought into operation. Germany halted certification in February 2022 after Russia recognized the separatist region of Donetsk and Luhansk shortly before the full-scale invasion. So for supporters of liberal internationalism, these energy ties promised stability. They argued that energy cooperation could keep channels open, channels of cooperation, of trade, of just getting along. That these channels would bind Russia to European markets and create incentives for moderation and cooperation. For critics, because we can imagine there were a ton, especially in parts of Central and Eastern Europe, the danger was quite obvious. Energy dependence on Russia could create strategic vulnerability. It could divide Europe, and it could weaken Ukraine by bypassing Ukrainian transit routes. And it could give Moscow, and this is important, it could give Moscow tools of pressure over European governments. European Commission officials and several East European governments warned that Nord Stream 2 and this is getting closer and closer to Russia for energy reliance would increase energy dependence in a negative way. So this is where the contrast with the European coal and steel community really becomes important. The ECSC was not simply about trade, it was about institutionalized interdependence among states that were moving into a shared legal and political order. So the Europe-Russia relationship was different. Russia was not being integrated into the European Union, was not being integrated into a European organization. It was not part of NATO. It was not part of the EU. It was not embedded into those same democratic security communities. It was instead more of just an economic reliance. And importantly, rather than transforming Russia's foreign policy, economic interdependence coexisted with Russian assertiveness at this time. In 2008, Russia fought a war with Georgia, a later EU-backed inquiry that we could do a whole video on why Russia invaded Georgia in 2008, what started that, what kicked off, was it firing on peacekeepers? Doesn't matter so much for this video, but we just have to keep in mind that this assertiveness for Russian authority, for Russia, was occurring during throughout this period. And then in 2014, Russia illegally annexed Crimea. The European Union described the annexation of Crimea as a gross violation of international law and, of course, Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. But at the same time, this interconnection meant that the response back to Russian transgressions was oftentimes limited and not as firm or not as biting, if we think of sanctions, as possibly could have been because of this interdependence. So we know that Germany's dependence on Russia was quite heavy. In 2021, Russia supplied 52% of Germany's natural gas imports. In 2022, that figure, though, did fall to 22%. But still a lot of reliance on Russia. And this idea that through interdependence, that Russia's behavior would be mitigated and would be less assertive throughout Europe was proving not to be true. Although the economies were very interconnected, Russia 2008 invaded Ukraine. 2008 Georgia, 2014 Ukraine, and then the full-scale invasion in 2022. So this idea that economic interdependence would lead to a less assertive foreign policy for the Russians didn't prove true. And instead, European countries like Germany started relying quite heavily on Russia for their energy, as nuclear power plants were being closed in Germany after the Fukushima disaster in Japan. Power plants were closing in Germany, more reliance on Russia. Leaders at the time in Europe and Russia were saying, well, that's okay. We will build this interdependence. We have this energy source in Russia. We can have closer economic ties. Remember, liberal internationalism said we can build these ties together. We would bring Russia closer into the European community. That would kind of calm down their behavior. We'd have closer economic ties and everyone would win. But we see that that didn't prove true, that the Russians still used a assertive foreign policy. And then what happened was that European countries were kind of tied to the Russian economy or Russian exports, that made it harder for them to put sanctions on. Harder to put sanctions on Russia. So when we think of some of the success stories of liberal institutionalism, like many point to the European Union today, the ECSC as a earlier rendition, as success stories. But we also see that there are some drawbacks to liberal internationalism that academics point to, where there are some shortcomings to having closer economies tied together. So I just wanted to kind of make a video to counter the ECSC, because the ECSC is kind of viewed as a success story, and then this interconnection between Europe and Germany and the Russians oftentimes is viewed as an example of where maybe interconnectedness failed to prevent war in Europe. Thank you.